Okay, so good morning. We are here today to bury Julius Caesar. No. So what we're looking at today, as you can see by some of these odd shapes that I have in front of me, is how can we cover difficult shapes. Now, depending on what you want to do with these, so they could be cupboards, they could be plant stands, they can be really whatever you want them to be, and it depends on what you want them to be as to how you'll progress with the project. So if you look at this, for example, as the project, this could be a plant stand, this could be a cupboard. Obviously these are miniature versions of what you would be making. You wouldn't make a plant stand at all because it would be pretty pointless, but if you wanted to make a plant stand that was going to sit in the corner of a lounge, maybe one either side of a bay window, for example, nice plant on it, looking pretty, looking symmetrical, you might make it in an octagon shape like that. You might make it circular. I haven't got a square, but obviously you could make one that was square as well, but square's fairly easy. What I'm really here today to look at is awkward shapes. So if we take this octagon, I'm trying to show this in a way that the camera will see. Hopefully you can see that if I wiggle that with just 4 posts in it, it's quite flexible, it moves quite a bit. If I now take this one, which has got 8 pins in it, there's almost no movement, it's quite rigid. So in this case, as you can see, we've put 8 pins in that to make a frame exactly the same as this one, but instead of just the 4 pins, we've put the full 8 in to make it much more rigid for covering it. Now, unfortunately, as you can see, hopefully, by the gap in here, I did make a slight error when I put this together, because if it was a cupboard, you'd need to leave a door on it. So I've glued all the pieces on by mistake, but it's not a complete mistake, because you might do that if you were just making a plant pot stand. However, you might want to make a plant pot stand in conjunction with a cabinet, in which case you would need to leave a door on it. Now, how you choose to create the door is up to you and your design. So you could leave one openable, or you could leave 2 openable, or 3 openable, or 4 openable, and have a lot of access. That would depend on what you were intending to use it for. So these pieces all have to be cut for this particular size of octagon. So what I did was I went on 2D design, I created the octagon and then worked out all the angles that I would need to cut the material at, and as it happened it worked out to be 22.5 degrees. And that's produced quite a good one. The reason there's gaps is because unfortunately I had this material to hand, but didn't have one that was just wide enough. This is just a millimetre short of what it needed to be to get the perfect angles with no gaps in. However, if you look at that straight down the end, we could always skim plane that on each face and get rid of that gap. Yeah. So again, most problems can be overcome. So how did we do that? Now, there it is. So what I did to wrap that wood around and glue that up, I set up 2 strips of tape . This is probably not going to go well because I'm trying to do it in a hurry, but I'll do my best. So we fold it back on itself just so that it grips and holds down to the tabletop. And then we fold that back and do another one about there. Like that. Now, this masking tape isn't particularly strong. It's a bit of a flimsy one, to be quite honest with you. But it will demonstrate the process and how it works. So basically, what I'm doing is I'm lining up the square edge of each piece against the square edge of this table. And then with the pieces being parallel on the tape, and square against the edge, they should work out right. Now that second one didn't go on perfectly, but never mind. You'll get the idea. Now we give those a nice push, and then basically all we do is we lift up the tape and the idea is we stand them up, wrap that around the shape, and of course the more you've got the easier it is, but basically the pieces of material flex and wrap, and obviously once you've got it basically in place you can put more tape round it and hold it tighter. Get that up, and then if you look at that on the end, hopefully the camera can see that they all fit perfectly. And the other thing that's important about that is that if I just quickly now rip it all off to show you the next important bit, if you didn't do it that way, how would you centre those pieces on there and get them in the right position? So if you look at that, hopefully the camera can see that. Hopefully the camera can see that. There's no specific way to locate that and get it right in the middle of this piece here. Now, if we hadn't cut the recesses in there, then you would have a corner point and a corner point to locate them to, which would make life easier. But the reason there's recesses in there, I'll be back in just 2 shakes of a lamb's tail, is because the other thing that you could do, rather than using dowel pins to locate it, you could make bits of square timber which drop into the recesses, which not only join the bits together, so you wouldn't need dowel pins now, but they give it rigidity too. So they give it rigidity the same as the dowel pins, but also they're on the very outside, which gives you more space inside the cupboard. So that's another way that you could create that skeleton or carcass ready for covering. And of course, like, you could use a thicker stick and then plane it down once it's glued in to the exact shape, particularly if you were doing a circle. You'd want that nicely finished because we don't want, excuse me, any awkward bits sticking out. So that's making your skeletons and how you would cover them and how you would glue and clamp the bits in. So that's that. Now, what else could we do with this one? Well, flexible ply, I'm hoping the camera can see this. Now, the cameraman will have to let me know how well is that focused in, and if you can actually see that that piece of ply is approximately 6mm thick, and what it has, I'll use my pencil to define it, it has an outer layer an outer layer and a very thin inner layer. So the direction of the grain on this face is going that way, and the direction of the grain on this face is going that way. And the direction of the grain in the middle is going across. And that's what enables, because the wood flexes easily across its grain, the middle layer is very thin to enable the whole sheet to flex. But if you flex it too much, it snaps. So it has got its limitations. Just going to bring those two pieces in. However, here's a longer thin piece, and now this is dry, bear in mind, very, very, very dry. So that's with no steaming, and that flexes fairly well. But if you go around something that's too small, then there is a strong likelihood that it will do what that other bit did, which is snap. Now, other types of flexible ply. Now, this one is birch ply, and essentially it's exactly the same. Straight grain that way, straight grain that way, very thin layer in between, but it's the grain in the middle is going this way. So actually this is stronger and stiffer than that flexible ply. However, this birch ply, which is thinner than that one, that's about 1.5 millimeters, thereabouts. This one's just over a millimeter, but again we've got straight grain that way, straight grain that way, and we've got a thin core going this way. But this one's much more flexible because it's thinner. However, it's very flexible that way. So as you can see, it will curl up quite small. So depending on what you're covering, depends on the kind of flexible ply that you choose to use. And then the next problem you've got is how are you going to fix it? So if I just pick this sheet back up again, and I roll that round there. The reason I haven't glued these on is because this stuff is so expensive, we can't afford to waste it. But just to give you an idea, you can see that that wraps round there quite nicely. However, the difficult part of doing this kind of wrap or work is how do you fix it? So if I move that out of the way just for a minute, you could pin and glue it. So if I let that thing open, you could put a small dab of glue here, here and here, and you could put a pin in there and there and there and let that dry. But I don't know if the camera can pick this up, but if I hold those there, can you see how it's bellying in the middle? And then if I were to do that, you still get a little belly or a lump between the two faces. So you'd need more dividers, if you like, to pin to keep that edge flat. That's point number one. The second problem that you're going to have when it is all wrapped up, and it would be more kind of prevalent if that went all the way round and joined up. But how do you stop that seam popping up? It's never going to stay perfectly flat. So to demonstrate that just a little bit better, in good old Blue Peter fashion, here's one I prepared earlier, and here's another one I prepared earlier. And what's slightly different about these is, so firstly, this is the thicker 6mm flexible ply, and I've had to save this specifically for this video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that tape. Now, that was dry wrapped around that frame. And as you can see, by dry wrapping it and leaving it for several days, it's taken a half circle shape. So it's not quite as hard now to flex as it would be if it was flat. So if I take that flat bit and I curve it and let go, straight away it goes almost flat. Whereas if you look at that side by side, or if I put them like that, you can see that's still got a substantial curve in it. That one's got a very, very gentle curve in it. Now, going to the other extreme, I'm going to unwrap this one. So what I did with this one, get all the masking tape off, which is a bit annoying and slightly time consuming, but worth it in the end. It'll be interesting to see. So this one has 2 layers. So imagine you wanted to make this plant pot holder or a stand or a cupboard, but you didn't actually want a skeleton at all. You just wanted the outside skin or frame, but you wanted it a bit more substantial, and you wanted to maybe put shelf in it. So this was steamed before I taped it. Not for very long, just over an ordinary domestic kettle for a few minutes. Probably not even that actually, probably about a minute. Just enough to warm it up and give it that extra bit of flexibility required. And I think if you compare it to that one, you can see that steaming it makes it hold its curve better and longer. And I'm quite convinced that if I'd have been able to steam that for say 3 to 4 minutes rather than a minute, when I took them out they would have pretty much stayed like that, because that is the purpose of steaming. Yeah. The other thing that I've also done, again, I'm trying to figure out the best angle for the camera to pick this up, but when you wrap that, if it's got a 90-degree edge on that face, they're not going to meet well. So to get those 2 faces to meet well, yeah, and get them as flat as you possibly can, it's prudent to cut a small angle on that face going inwards and a small angle on that face going inwards. I'm doing that with my hand, very exaggerated to make the point. Get that tape out of the way. But when you wrap those round with a small angle, the 2 surfaces will touch. Whereas if they're square, it will tend to force that edge up, so it won't go into a complete circle. Now, why is that important? Well, the reason it's important is because what we would do is we would apply glue to this surface, thin skimmer glue to that surface, put those together and put them at opposite points. So as you put the outer one in, the outer one automatically starts to pull the inner one together. That is our core, and this is our former. So they would be wrapped around the core, so the core keeps them solid in the middle. And let's take that tape off because that might inhibit it going in. Because when you want something like this to work, every millimetre counts. Oh, there goes the core. Right, can we pull those in tight enough? Hey! Champion. So, core, outer former, and your 2 glued pieces of flexi-ply. And basically once that lot dries, you pull out your plug, you pull out your work Okay, so here's where not gluing the former together comes in handy, because you can take the base off and you can push it out from the bottom. He says hopefully. Needing a stick because my fingers aren't quite strong enough. But basically, you give that a shove and eventually it all comes out as one bit. Now, the next thing that is important, yeah, obviously you can see that this method or process is a bit fiddly actually. Probably not ideal. It works, you can do it if that's all you've got or all you can do. However, how else could this same process be done? I'd like to say I'll leave you to think about that, but we haven't got time because it'd take too long. So, what you would do, or what would probably be done in industry, is this former and this core would be jigged up so that that would remain solid, but it would probably maybe have something, a core or a plate on either end. This would be divided in two, and then it would have a plate on each half. So you now got two halves of a former with a flat plate on them. And that flat plate would be clamped together. And obviously there would be a corresponding one on that side. So if you were able to separate it, you'd have semicircle with a flat plate each side, semicircle with a flat plate each side. And what you would then do is the core would be on a plate, and there would probably be a plate each end to help locate it, which would also keep the material flat. So if you look at that material there, you can see the two layers have started moving apart. Well, that's no good. You need those two layers to stay flat together. So the mould would need a plate on it. And my guess would be, I can't guarantee it, but my guess would be you'd have a flat plate on the core, flat plate on the core, and what would happen is the two halves of the mould would come in. This would be held in a jig, so it would be held up with the plates in the right place, and the material would be held, and the two halves would come together, bosh, squeeze all the glued material round it and be clamped. And then you would eliminate these tiny gaps and imperfections, because you'd have a perfect circle former and a perfect core. And the material would obviously be prepared and calculated down to minute degrees, so you wouldn't get all these tiny little gaps that unfortunately we're getting in here, because we haven't got press tools to put them together and blah 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 blah. So flexible ply and how it's put together and utilised to make interesting frames. Now finally, the only other item to show you in my Here's I made one earlier format. Let's just say you wanted to make a chair, either for relaxing indoors or maybe in the garden, whatever. One piece of flexi-ply probably wouldn't be enough. Wouldn't be very hard to break that, as you've seen in an earlier demonstration. I'm not going to keep breaking bits. However, if you put 3 pieces of 6mm together, what do you get? You suddenly get a piece of 18mm ply, which is a lot potentially stronger once it's stuck together and fixed in a position. And how do we do that? So we make a jig. And in this case, all you would do is you would glue those 3 pieces together, sit them in the jig, push them together. Now, here's the interesting bit. You'd put those together, obviously with clamps, and provide more pressure than unfortunately I can provide, but I don't know if you can see that, but as you clamp those, what happens, and even more so with glue on, is they will start to move. So when you're doing something like that, you would either, again, like I said with the other one, you'd need like a flat plate there to stop it moving, and the pieces of wood would have to be very precision cut, and you'd have to allow for the angles that they were all going to end up at the end, so that you ended up with a perfect angles and all the rest of it. Or you can have an open-ended jig like this one and make sure the material is all long enough so that when you compress it together and it slides and moves, you've got enough overhang each side that once you release it from the clamps and it's all set in its curvature, you can cut the excess off, and then you end up with a perfectly glued piece, and you can work on it, shape it or whatever from there. Now I'm going to go to, here's one I made earlier. Can we put the cameras on pause for a second? Right, so here we are back again, and this wasn't the piece I was hoping to show, because I actually have a chair which I made a big press mould for and all the rest of it, but there's just too much stuff in the cupboard to get it. So this one will do. So one of our students wanted to make a table that was supported by an arched leg, and this is his arched leg. And the idea was that the table, this would be planed flat, and the tabletop was just going to perch on there, and then he had some idea about how he was going to fix it together, either with concealed bolts or screws or something like that. I don't know how well the camera can see it because he has put a lot of filler on this, but if I show it that way, you can see that it's wood, the same as the flexible ply, a bit lighter in colour, probably just came from a different supplier or different tree. But if you look at the end, you can see that that is all end grain. I might be able to reveal some of it. Try and get a bit of glass paper on there. Take some of that filler off that he put on there. I don't know, taking that off. This is where you could do with a power sander. No, God, he's put loads on there. Absolutely put loads on there. I don't know why he did that, but anyway. Now what I'm going to do, hopefully, right, I don't know if this is going to work, so this is a bit of a gamble, but if I turn that up like that and show that to the camera, Mr. Cameraman, can you tell me whether you can see the layers in there? Yeah. Now what might make them show up a bit more is if I wet it and do that. So hopefully that will show up the grain in there even more. And as you can see, that is, oh, where's my rule gone? That is 38mm. So basically we made a former and a frame and pressed them together, and he's put 7 layers together there. I would imagine somewhere between 6 and 7 layers to get that thickness. So that was quite a hefty one, and obviously we had to trim it off at the right angle. So there you go. If you wanted that, imagine bigger, big circle, cupboard, plant stand, you glue the laminate together, and once it's glued together, it's pretty solid. I just quickly grab a hammer. You can dent the surface of it, but you're not going to break it in a hurry. So there you go. That is basically flexible ply, shaping flexible ply. The only other thing is I am in the process of building a steam box, but the steam box is only so big. It's about, I don't know, 6 inches by 5, something like that. So you can put longish strips, about 2.5 feet of the flexible ply in it to steam it. But obviously the bigger the product that you want to steam, the bigger the steam box you're going to need. But that's basically it. So you can segment to make an outer covering, or you can use flexible pliers. Now, the one thing that I did forget actually, which I will quickly mention, unfortunately I haven't got a piece to hand, but if you've got a really really thin razor sharp blade, if you don't need it to be too circular, if you only need a light curve in something, one of the things that you can do, for example, if you look down the length of that piece of pine, or you could do it with MDF, is you cut about half the depth or half the thickness of the material with a thin blade, and you put multiple slots in. If you think of a comb to comb your hair, a bit like that, and by removing those various veins of material, it allows the wood to flex. But of course, again, you'd be doing it down the length of the grain, and what happens down the length of the grain if you flex it too much? Snaps. So it can be done, but it's got its limitations. But if you wanted, you know, a solid wood sort of look, and a proper end grain look rather than the multi-layer look of plywood. Some people like that plywood look, and when it's sanded and cleaned up and finished really well, it looks really nice actually. It's quite striking. But if you didn't want that, you can do it in ply. You can make flexible ply out of MDF. And that's about it. I think if you need to know any more than that, then you need to get on Google and do some research. Bye bye for now.